Hello. Wow, this mic works. I would, of course, be the only presenter whose face is 50 feet by 50 feet. Good afternoon, UMD. The very first word I ever spoke clearly was free, actually. This is a true story. And I like to tell myself, and of course I would like to tell you all, that it's because even as an infant, I was some sort of radical gender activist, a dismantler, a transgressor. But the reality is, and my mother tells this story much better than I can, of course, there was an advertisement at the time, a television commercial, for some deal or another. Something was being given away if you bought something else. So with this particular advertisement that would come across the television, the word free in bright red flashing letters would come across the screen. So there I am, maybe 2 or 3 years old, sitting on the floor in front of the TV in our one-bedroom South Bronx apartment, saying free, free, free to the television screen as my mother listened from the kitchen. It's a cute enough story, sure. But it's actually really important. Because you see, though I wouldn't be able to see myself or to self-identify as any sort of radical gender activist or dismantler or transgressor for years to come, obviously, the word free and freedom has been a persistent theme throughout my life thus far. Maybe even a lifelong character trait, if you will. Speaking of freedom, I'm Black, by the way. Afro-Latinx, to be more specific. Puerto Rican, to be absolutely specific. My family comes from Ponce, Puerto Rico, which is on the south side of the island. Beautiful city. They have Carnival every year. We also come from a town just north of Charlotte, North Carolina, called Mooresville, which is actually also known as Race City, USA, home of the Earnhardts, Dale and Dale Jr. Fun fact, random, Dale Earnhardt Jr. and I had the same high school English teacher. Go Mooresville Blue Devils if you're into random fun facts in NASCAR, but I digress. My family obviously speaks Spanish. We speak Spanglish like no family you've ever encountered, I assure you. And we speak English in all sorts of accents and dialects and vernacular. And yet not one of them has been able to grasp they, them gender pronouns in reference to a singular person. And I know that people think that's really hard, and sometimes people tell me that it doesn't make sense because suddenly everyone's an expert in grammar and syntax. But whatever. Some things take more time and patience than others. What I'm confident we're going to be able to do in this space together today is take the discussion of gender or gender identity well beyond gender pronoun. The clicker is working for me. So I'm not a man or a woman. I'm neither. I have no specified gender identity, actually. Now, all of these gender identities are clearly valid and enough and are validated everywhere all the time. They just don't contain, confine, or define who I am. And it's really okay, I promise. Like, you're okay, your cisgender identities and lives are safe in this space. And to be quite frank, in that regard, you all are pretty much safe everywhere, right? Which is far more than I can say for those of us who identify as genderqueer or transgender, especially if we're people of color. And particularly, you're more safe than Black trans women and femmes who are being brutalized and murdered across the country at an alarming rate. So what I would like you all to consider in this space today is the fact that people with non-binary gender identities, people who are genderqueer, people who have no gender identity at all, people whose genders have been ambiguous or fluid, have existed in cultures throughout the world, throughout the ages, and have been referred to by all sorts of names, many of which I don't know. What I do recognize, however, is that when you hear genderqueer or when you hear non-binary gender identity, I'm not really who or what comes to mind visually or aesthetically. So what are the dominant representations of non-binary identity that you've seen? No doubt what you've seen has been fierce and beautiful and sexy and self-assured and bending and challenging all of the conceptions and perceptions you have of gender and sexuality. But what happens when someone who is not as easily othered, at least not visually or aesthetically, decides that they no longer identify or that they've never identified along the gender binary? Moreover, where is the Black assumed cisgender body positioned in current discourse around gender expansiveness? I like to think that there's real potential in me standing here in this flesh with this beating heart, with this made up certain mind. And I'd like to believe that there's real potential in conversations such as this one, where we're discussing the idea that non-binary gender really gives others the permission to self-explore, to self-examine, to self-identify, to self-determine. All of these self-acts are really an affront to colonization, particularly to colonization of the body. I challenge you to consider the fact that the resistance to non-binary or genderqueer identity is really about a widespread fear, right? And I think that that fear is rooted in attachment to labels. I'm suggesting that the fear or the pushback or the resistance to non-binary or genderqueer identities is really about a fear of us losing those labels which assign certain privilege, which assign status. White supremacy and cis heteropatriarchy are subverted when we dare to define ourselves for ourselves, right? But if I, in this Black and unapologetic body, can stand here before you today at a university and define myself for myself, who can't? White people? You? Something about that doesn't sound right. When we dare to define ourselves for ourselves, it's the beginning, it's the foundation of a decolonial praxis. And that sounds super lofty and academic, right? But I think that decolonization, radicalism, resistance really begins when we begin to see ourselves, think about ourselves, and speak about ourselves differently. When we self-define the parameters, when we set the parameters for ourselves. For me, I like to say that the beginnings or the roots of my personal decolonial praxis formed when my response to the question, and I get this question often because people are just rude, right? So like, you're not a man, so what are you, a woman? When my response became a calm and certain neither, that was the birth of my decolonial praxis. I'd like to believe that my neither here today resonates with each and every one of you, and I know that that's not going to be the case, but I'm sure that it resounds and it reverberates. And I like to believe that oppressive constructs are already cracking from the sound. Thank you.